Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm good.
Okay, well, let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is a Nonzero podcast. You're Sarah Leah Whitson. You are currently executive director of DAWN, DAWN, which is Democracy for the Arab World Now. That's a group that was started by Jamal Khashoggi, who, of course, was murdered by Saudi operatives in Istanbul some years ago. Until a few years ago, you were at Human Rights Watch. You were executive director of Middle East and the North Africa division, right? And in fact, you were on this podcast, I think maybe while you still had that job, but in any event, your commentary was very illuminating. So when I saw on Twitter that you've been keeping track of the various horrors that have unfolded since Hamas militants entered Israel and committed a lot of atrocities 9 days ago, I thought it would be good to have you on and get your perspective on this. You're conversant in the context, in the relevant international law and so on. So, so first of all, this is we're taping Monday midday. This will air by this evening. What is your sense for the situation on the ground right now, or what is consuming most of your attention right now?
Well, what's consuming most of my attention right now is the likelihood of an imminent ground invasion that is coupled with ceaseless, relentless aerial bombardment in Gaza, not just the north, by the way, but the south as well, and the shocking but entirely predictable and entirely man-made humanitarian catastrophe that's being created.
So when you say North and South Gaza, of course, Gaza is a small place. It's about 140 square miles. The north is where Gaza City is. That's the part that Israel has said should be evacuated of all civilians.
That's right. It's called on over 1 million people to just get up and leave and go south, except that people who have been trying to flee south have been bombarded, and the south is still being bombarded. So the notion that there's really any place safe for civilians is a big lie.
Now, so far as you know, is Hamas concentrated in northern Gaza? Is that the idea, or have they stated a rationale for focusing on northern Gaza, Israel? I mean,
honestly, I don't believe that they're concentrated at any one place because that would make them much easier targets. I don't know what the stated rationale is, but I do know that the obvious rationale is an effort to denude northern Gaza of its population and to extend it into some massive buffer zone to keep Palestinians further away from Israeli settlement communities within Israel. That is what I sort of see emerging. I don't think Israel has plans to reoccupy Gaza or even northern Gaza, but if it can create a human-free zone and declare it a safe zone or a buffer zone or whatever, then basically it extends its rule and its ability to shoot anything that moves, let's say, in this newly created buffer zone. That's what I'm speculating.
So there are a lot more, of course, some of the settlements, the Israeli, well, they're not settlements. This is part of Israel proper, or at least Israel even before 1967. But the Israeli villages around there, I gather some of them have been evacuated, but you're saying that there are more people in more villages in Israel near northern than southern Gaza. And
Exactly.
That may be the motivation. Okay. Before we get further into this situation, I was just wondering, as a kind of, it may seem academic to people, but as a matter of international law, to get back to the original atrocities committed by Hamas, is Hamas as an organization in principle susceptible to international law in the way a nation state is, or what? How does international law get applied to a group like that?
Yeah. So basically, as an armed group, they are bound by what's called Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions that applies to any parties to a conflict, whether an irregular militia or a state army. And that is the broadest and most important principle of international humanitarian law, requiring a distinction, the principle of distinction and the principle of proportionality, that any armed group, any party to a conflict has to distinguish between civilians and military objectives and may target only military objectives. And that where it is impossible to distinguish, for example, that there be a rule of proportionality, that the incremental military benefit from targeting something where civilians may be present is much, much greater than the harm to civilians. And different militaries have different sort of formulas for what constitute proportionate harm, but the Israeli proportionality calculus has always been among the worst.
Okay, so in principle, Hamas unequivocally, in a formal sense, violated international law to begin with. As a practical matter, because you might say failing to distinguish between civilians and military, or you might say actually, being quite aware of the distinction and wanting to inflict a lot of civilian deaths. But in any event, as a practical matter, and of course we're getting way ahead of the game before we get back to what's going on, but the International Criminal Court, I guess, would be the mechanism of enforcement, and of course, I don't think Israel has signed on to the treaty creating it, right? And certainly Hamas hasn't. But still, is there a way in the long run that either could be, as a practical matter, held accountable through the formal mechanisms of enforcement?
Yeah. So, Bob, this is a very practical and immediate matter, in fact. In 2019, the International Criminal Court announced that it was opening an investigation into war crimes in Palestine since June 2014. So basically, the ICC declared its investigation retroactive to June, I believe, June 9, 2014, and ongoing until then. Once the ICC has accepted jurisdiction and opened an investigation, as it has, based on the request of the state of Palestine, to conduct an investigation, anybody, any national of any country who commits war crimes in that territory, in this case in the state of Palestine, which includes Gaza, is subject to the court's jurisdiction. It's completely irrelevant at that stage that Israel is not a party to the ICC. And more significantly, perhaps as Americans, it's insignificant and irrelevant that the United States is not a party to the ICC. Both the US and Israel, and of course Hamas and any Palestinian armed group who are committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other violations of the Rome Statute, are subject to investigation, prosecution, and liability by the International Criminal Court, which has an active, ongoing investigation underway now. This is extraordinary. This is an extraordinary opportunity for international justice. It certainly didn't exist when Israel launched a massive war against Gaza in 2006, in 2009, in 2011, in 2014. It was only in 2019 that the court said, okay, we're going back and looking since 2014. And so this is not a hypothetical matter. This is a real, ongoing, live investigation now.
Okay. And as first of all, so a large majority of nations have signed on to the ICC, I gather. Now, but have Russia and China, what about the other kind of superpowers?
Nope. Russia has not, China has not, the US has not. The UK has signed, France has signed, a number of African states have signed, and a number of Latin American states have signed. But why this investigation is so important to the ICC, is so important to anything the ICC does anywhere in the world, is because if the ICC proves itself to be to fail to provide accountability for Israeli crimes in Gaza that are ongoing now, that have been ongoing for the past 17 years, it will lose all credibility and ability to prosecute any other case. As it is, the International Criminal Court's credibility is on very thin ice. And a number of African states have withdrawn from the ICC, saying, what, you're only going to prosecute people of color? You're only going to prosecute people in Africa, Sudan and Libya? When are you going to act against Israel? Because again, this investigation has been underway since 2019.
And what were the specific alleged crimes at that point?
So the complaint by the state of Palestine to the International Criminal Court asked the court to take jurisdiction, declare jurisdiction of crimes since the 2014 war. It took the ICC 5 years in 2019 to say, okay, we accept. Then there was a suit, actually, a challenge to the declaration of jurisdiction by the court, where basically the Israelis and the Americans said, no, the ICC can't take jurisdiction because because Palestine is not really a state. The court of the ICC heard that appeal and rejected it, reaffirming in 2021 that the jurisdiction is valid and the state of Palestine legitimately asked for the court to intervene and as a party, as a signatory to the Rome Statute. And now, as a result, there is a live investigation underway. Okay.
Now, I suspect one thing some Israelis might say about that allegation of war crimes, having to do with things done in Gaza during previous conflicts, is, well, we were responding to missile strikes or something. But I gather, like, war crimes, I mean, first of all, transborder aggression is a crime in its own right. So like Russia invading Ukraine, that's illegal, but
not under the Rome Statute. I think it's very
under the UN Charter.
Yeah, but that's not. But the International Criminal Court only hears breaches of the Rome Statute.
Right, and that is indifferent to who started the war. Right, once a war is started, both belligerents or all belligerents are responsible for complying with the laws of war. Right, so at that point, it really no longer matters who started it, in a sense.
Well, I believe there's a provision for the crime of aggression in the Rome Statute, but the more important point that you're making is, by and large, for international humanitarian law, which are the laws of war, it really doesn't matter who started it. That's kind of a different body of war.
Right.
The laws of war are meant to regulate how parties to a conflict fight. Why they're fighting at that point is not relevant.
Right.
The rules are you have to distinguish between civilian and military targets.
And I'm sure you wouldn't, again, it's obvious that Hamas committed crimes with the initial incursion, but is it, as far as what's going on now, is it, it's completely clear to you that, in your view, Israel is violating international law?
Well, I mean, it's as clear as day, and you don't need to take my word for it. You can take the word of Israeli officials who've openly declared that they are going to commit and are committing war crimes. When the Israeli government, when Bibi Netanyahu declares that he is cutting off all water, electricity, fuel, medicine, and food, imposing a total siege on Gaza, that is a war crime. You are not allowed to deprive civilians of items essential to their survival, and water and fuel and electricity are the most basic of those. So that's a prima facie on its face, a war crime.
Mm-hmm.
The indiscriminate bombardment of residential buildings, killing, as we now know, over 3,000 people, over 600 children, that is very apparent as war crimes and could amount to crimes against humanity. We've now also seen cases of deliberate targeting of journalists. Israel murdered a journalist in Lebanon 2 days ago, as well as
we know that it was intentional. Who was that?
The journalist was a cameraman, I believe, for Al Jazeera, who has posted critically on Israel, commented critically on Israel. But it's very clear that they were these four people, I believe the number was four, 3 injured and 1 killed, were deliberately targeted and killed. This wasn't sort of an accidental, random. Israel is not randomly or indiscriminately bombarding Lebanon yet. This was a targeted killing.
So now that hasn't gotten. I mean, I heard a report. I thought I heard a report that a Reuters cameraman or something, but I heard reports about something like this. I haven't. Has it been well documented somewhere that this must have been a targeted killing? Or
I mean, that's what I've read, and like I said, this was a single sort of hit operation,
single strike, and there were Now back to what Israel would say about, yes, they're hitting civilian structures, but Hamas is embedded in civilian structures, which I assume is true.
Right.
But how does that relate to your indictment?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the laws of war do not make it illegal to have what's called urban warfare. Oftentimes, wars are conducted in cities. If your city is under attack, you are firing back from your city. Mm-hmm. The obligation on a group like Hamas or any armed group that's fighting in civilian areas is to avoid endangering civilians to the extent feasible, to avoid placing weapons and material in civilian areas to the extent feasible. So Hamas is breaching or violating the laws of war if it can be shown that they had feasible, as in militarily feasible, alternatives. Standing out in the open desert is not a feasible alternative because obviously they could be targeted and killed anytime. Mm-hmm. Even if Hamas is present in civilian areas, which, by the way, Israeli military barracks, the IDFs, the military defense units, they are also located in civilian areas throughout Israel. Because it's just part of a very densely populated area. The presence of military targets within a civilian area does not give Israel, or Hamas for that sake, license to indiscriminately bombard an area on the basis of, well, Hamas is hiding in there. That's not a good enough, that you don't have permission, carte blanche, to do that under international law. Does that mean that international law makes it very hard for someone to fight a war legally in an urban area? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Mm-hmm. And that's because international law is designed to protect civilians, not to help one party or another win the war.
Mm-hmm. So are there certain kinds of embedding within civilian populations that would be just on the face of it illegal? Like if suppose you're storing a ton of ammunition in the basement of a hospital, is that like just...
I think the crime that people think of and the word that's often used is civilian shielding. And there is a crime of shielding. And that is deliberately using civilians to shield your military from attack. And that, requires showing sort of intent. Mm-hmm. I think on the face of it, storing weapons beneath a hospital is a clear violation of the prohibition of avoiding endangering civilians, because that is overwhelmingly likely that you're going to invite a military attack, which itself, even if it's illegal, nevertheless, you're endangering civilians.
Right.
It would be very hard for one group to argue that it was impossible for them to find somewhere else to hide their weapons.
Now, have you seen reports that Hamas is preventing people from fleeing from the north to the south, like establishing blockades?
I have not seen that.
I think
That
the
would be
IDF made the claim on Twitter.
Well, the IDF's made a lot of claims. So, the IDF also claimed they didn't kill Shireen Abu Akleh. The IDF is, making all kinds of claims. So that doesn't matter much to me. I need to see the evidence. If it's true that Hamas is blocking civilians from leaving, that is the crime of shielding. And that is a very serious violation of the laws of war.
Yeah. I would, this is just a little side commentary on how our media mediate things. I saw a number of videos during the siege of Mariupol in Ukraine, more than one, purporting to show that the Azov, people from the Azov brigade had set up blockades and were preventing civilians from leaving Mariupol because presumably the argument was they knew they'd be more vulnerable if there were no civilians around. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't get any traction in American media because of the side we were on in the war. I think this Israeli one is getting more traction and I just want to say, I don't know if either is true. I would just warn people against assuming that in a war that America has any kind of interest in, that assuming that it's very easy to get a clear and objective view of what's actually going on. Those things are just going to be processed by media and even by social media according to the way Americans and the American government and American media feel about the particular war. Sorry, do you want to say anything about?
Well, I mean, yes, I strongly agree, and unfortunately, what we've seen is, it goes much further than that. We have seen President Biden make false claims, say lies. He went on national television and he claimed that he saw pictures of decapitated babies at a time when this was reported all over the world's media based on the allegation of one Israeli quasi-soldier. He's like head of a, quasi-military unit, who is himself known, and we've brought a case against him, to incite pogroms against Palestinians as he incited the pogrom in Hawara. Then, given sort of everyone sort of questioning those claims because no evidence has yet to emerge of any decapitated babies, the White House had to retract President Biden's statements and to clarify, oh yeah, well, he didn't actually see any pictures, but that's what the Israelis confirmed to him. Again, claims. And it's extremely dangerous. But the problem is, for myself as a human rights advocate, as an analyst, I don't want to debate whether babies were decapitated or killed. It's all gross. But there's a reason why there are these claims of decapitated babies, because they really incite people's emotions and allows them to then justify killing thousands of Palestinian babies. It's horrific, but we have to stick to the facts. We have to stick to the truth.
That's right. It does seem absurd on the one hand to quibble like on how a slaughtered baby was slaughtered, right?
Right.
But it is a fact that the level of retaliation that's going to be demanded by the Israeli people can be heavily influenced by a single anecdote that becomes a kind of rallying cry. That's just human nature.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly why it was deployed. I hope we don't find the evidence. I hope there's no evidence that ever emerges of decapitated babies or raped women.
Now, by the way, the raped women, I heard like Jake Tapper on CNN assert with a fair amount of, confidence that had happened. I was wondering, I had heard it. I hadn't seen documentation. Do we know that happened? By Hamas. This is Israeli women being raped by Hamas.
I have not seen any documentation of this. I've talked to a number of journalists on the ground who've been in southern Israel, who've been interviewing victims of the Hamas massacres. And they told me that they knew of one woman who had alleged that she had been raped. But as far as I know, as far as I've read, as far as I've heard, there is zero evidence of any kind of widespread or systematic rape at all.
And again, Hamas did things that are pretty much as horrible as what humans are capable of. There's no dispute over that. The question, but for the reasons that we mentioned, I think sometimes particularly inflammatory anecdotes are worth checking just because how they'll play out. I mean, we're seeing, and I guess that brings us back to where we are on the ground in Gaza. There's a kind of a curious thing, which is that if, so there's two kind of thresholds of evacuation. Israel wants them to go from northern to southern Gaza. There's also the question of whether they would be allowed to go into Egypt. Egypt doesn't want them to go into Egypt for various reasons. And so as of now, they're kind of stuck. And it occurred to me that, like, if they stay there, they risk being killed. But if they leave, this may, in retrospect, look like ethnic cleansing. And now, when we spoke last time on my podcast, I remember you saying ethnic cleansing per se is not covered under international law. But there is forced relocation and so on. So what about forced relocation? Things that violate international is what Israel has already demanded. Does that constitute illegal forced relocation, or would it depend on them actually leaving Gaza and going into Egypt, or what?
Right. So the law defines the crime of forcibly displacing a population as the crime of forced displacement. And again, a lot of these crimes, they look to intent. It's important to note that the ICRC, I'm pretty sure, unless I'm getting it wrong,
that stands for
Red Cross.
Okay.
Which never speaks publicly, but did the Norwegian Refugee Council, which is probably one of the most prominent refugee organizations in the world, have already called out the actions of Israel to force Palestinians to flee as an act of forced displacement. And there's tremendous concern that the goal is what it has been for a very, very long time. And this is not the first time that Israel has tried to drive Palestinians out of Gaza and to relocate them to Egypt, to the Sinai Desert. That is the strategy, that is the plan. Push them out, pay off Egypt to let them live in camps and never let them back in. Because Gaza is a huge problem for Israeli expansionist goals. There's 2.5 million and a tiny streak of land that is completely disconnected to the West Bank. And, the notion that there can be any kind of a Palestinian state with this little rump piece of Gaza is, a permanent problem from them. So what many people fear is that Israel is in the process of executing a long-held plan to drive the population out of Gaza. And if they can get half of them out now, half of them kick the can down the road, well, fine. And that is why so many people have concluded that this is, in fact, the crime of forced displacement.
So if they can empty half of Gaza now, you mean move the people in the north to southern Gaza, that's progress from their point of view. Now, they would presumably, in the long run, wouldn't they have to occupy northern Gaza to make that an enduring fact?
Not necessarily. I mean, you have drones, you have planes, you have all kinds of satellite surveillance. Obviously we know now that Israeli intelligence and surveillance is not as superpower effective as we thought it could be. But you don't physically need to be on the ground to enforce.
But I mean. There's
not going to be anything to return to, Bob. They are going to reduce all of northern Gaza to rubble. That process is underway. It's going to be even less inhabitable than it is now. They were saying yesterday, the Americans, they're letting in water. There's no more water pipes in northern Gaza. All the water pipes have been busted. So you make something an impossibility to return to. Who's going to be able to return to rubble and no water and no food and no electricity?
Yeah, on the point of initially actually cutting off the water and the power and stating it as a fact, and in fact, the defense minister stated it in the same utterance as saying these people are animals, and my inference was he was saying all 2 million of them are animals. I mean, I don't know why. He was justifying doing the water and power, cutting off water and power to all 2 million. So I don't, and some of his kind of defenders were saying, well, he just meant Hamas as animals. Well, then that's a non sequitur. It doesn't, if Hamas are the animals, that doesn't justify cutting off the water and power to 2 million. In any event, Biden and Blinken have been saying now we expect Israel to comply with the laws of war, but they've been saying that after Israel, by its own account, quit complying with the laws of war, right? I mean, they're almost stating it as future guidance. Of course, we expect them to keep complying with international law, kind of. But
I'm sorry, it's complete bullshit. It's complete bullshit. From the very first moment, Israel made clear that it was going to exact revenge, and it's going to exact revenge on the civilian population. And they have kept true to their promise. And the announcement of the shutting off of electricity and water and fuel would have been the appropriate moment for the U.S. to say, okay, we can't support this. Mm-hmm. Instead, in addition to whatever throwaway line of saying we expect Israel to comply with the laws of war, or more ridiculously, to keep complying with the laws of war, the U.S. has promised and is sending millions in additional military support, has stationed a massive U.S. naval tanker. From what I understand, they are ready, willing, and able to physically, kinetically support Israel in this war. So, the U.S., we're not just observers here, kind of advising and guiding Israel to do this or do that. The U.S. is actively involved here, actively gave Israel the green light to, in Blinken words, do what it needs. Has thought about talking about a ceasefire, but then, as you know, Secretary Blinken, after even merely tweeting the word ceasefire, deleted them, and has now apparently banned the word ceasefire, de-escalation of hostilities from any mention by anyone else in the State Department.
Mm-hmm. So, as we said, like if the people, to the extent that the people vacate, and wait, let me make sure I understand you. So forced relocation, that law could apply even before they've left all of Gaza. It could apply to what's happening now. Okay.
Yes.
So if they don't leave and a lot of them get slaughtered, some people would raise the question of genocide. Now, genocide is a term that, so far as I can tell, has had its definition kind of loosened and expanded since immediately after World War II, when it was taken to refer to, the actual attempt to exterminate an entire ethnic group. And the Holocaust was the archetypal example. The term has become used more loosely, sometimes very loosely. Vladimir Putin used it to justify the invasion of Ukraine. People have applied it to Vladimir Putin in ways that I think is pretty loose. But I'm not really sure what the current status in international law of the definition of genocide is. What does it mean now, and does it apply to what's going on in Gaza, or for that matter, to what Hamas initially did to Israel? Which anyway.
Yeah. I think you're right that since the Genocide Convention was passed and the legal definition agreed to, and by the way, based on the archetype of the Armenian genocide.
Was that as much? When was the Genocide Convention?
The Armenian genocide was in 1915, but when Raphael Lemkin, the great Jewish lawyer and scholar who coined the term genocide, he coined it specifically with reference to what had happened to the Armenian people in the Ottoman provinces.
So this was right after World War II that the term was coined?
1915.
Really? The term goes back to then?
Yes, Raphael Lemkin coined the term genocide to refer to the mass slaughter of Armenians by the Turks in the Ottoman Empire in 1915. I mean,
when was the Genocide Convention?
Oh, the Genocide Convention was much later than that.
That was after World War II.
Yeah, I mean, it takes decades for these things to come to fruition.
Right.
But I mean, the term is for one party or one state to attempt to destroy, and here's the important part, in whole or in part, another group because of their ethnic or national, I think it includes racial, religious category or class. So some genocide scholars, and I'm not a genocide scholar, but groups of genocide scholars have already issued preliminary findings to say that Israel is violating the Genocide Convention because it has showed an intent, given some of the statements that we were talking about before and the actual practices, it has shown an intent to destroy at least part of the Palestinian population in Gaza for no reason other than they are Palestinian. You know, just today, I believe, or yesterday, a senior Israeli official, I'm pretty sure it was the Israeli president, who said that there are no Palestinian civilians, that all of the Palestinians are responsible because they support Hamas. Now, that is a genocidal statement. And I think it's statements like that, as coupled with the actions of indiscriminate bombardment and the mass civilian casualty tolls just over 5 days, that has led numerous genocide scholars to conclude that Israel is committing a genocide or is showing the intent to commit genocide. I don't think any major human rights organization or any major organization, including my own, Dawn, has issued that kind of a definitive assessment yet. It is, considered a very, very serious term to use. And notwithstanding the way it is flippantly thrown around by people, just the way the word fascist or Nazi, is getting thrown around very sloppily, I think there is very serious merit to the conclusion of these genocide scholars. And I expect that organizations like Dawn, like Amnesty International, like Human Rights Watch will sit down and pause to consider the evidence and consider the guidance. I believe the Raphael Lemkin Institute, which is an institute of genocide scholars, has now issued, I'm going to say 3, the number could be 5, genocide warnings, atrocity alerts, saying that what's happening now, is a trigger for a genocide alert.
And by the same token, it seems to me you could argue that Hamas committed genocide. Of course, I mean, Hamas hasn't signed the Genocide Convention. Israel presumably has, but you could certainly argue that they were killing a large number of Israelis just because they were Israeli, or some would say because, well, not all of them were Jews, actually. Some of them were Arab Israelis, but still, one could make the case, right? Okay.
Well, I mean, I think one would have to examine the statements made by Hamas about their attack on southern Israel. I don't know if you've heard any of the Hamas statements. I think it is worth listening to what they're saying and what they're claiming to understand if there are indicia of intent there.
What are they saying?
I'm not going to, unfortunately, even in progressive shows, it's just become a red line in American media to speak for Hamas or paraphrase Hamas.
Or be seen as, right.
Frankly, I can't do it because overnight my Twitter feed will be, filled with claims that I am a Hamas spokesperson. So what I say to people is go and find and listen. They put out some English statements explaining their attack. I think it's filled with a lot of lies. I heard it. But it is important for people to listen to what's being said and judge for themselves.
I mean, they are on the record, I assume, of seeking the elimination of the Israeli state. You can take that. You could say that they could say we just mean regime change, I guess. We just mean we want a government that doesn't favor Jews in any sense or something. But they've said a lot of things that, well, look, I'm not an expert on what they've said. Of course, Israel would say, well, we haven't said we're trying to destroy the Palestinian people or the...
Yes, they have. That's the thing.
Well, they haven't said they're trying to destroy them, have they?
No. But when you say we are launching a war and every Palestinian, there is no such thing as a Palestinian civilian. Okay, that's a pretty genocidal statement. I don't see another way to slice it.
And that's the defense minister and I guess maybe others.
I thought it was the president, but I'd have to go back and check.
I think you're right. The president did say it. He tried to walk it back. What's his name? Herzog? he did seemingly clearly say they're all responsible because they could have risen up, which is kind of ironic when you, on the one hand, characterize Hamas appropriately as authoritarian autocrats who do not permit elections, to then say, why didn't the people vote them out of office, in effect? But, it's like, I think rising up against Hamas would be a pretty perilous endeavor. Anyway, by the way, this goes back to ancient history. I'm not sure if it's so long ago that I doubt either of us recalls clearly, but the way Hamas came into power is the Bush administration, as part of its democracy, its desire to spread democracy everywhere, supported elections in Gaza, supported Hamas, was fine with Hamas participating, and then Hamas won. This is like 2008 or something. They said, no, that's not a legitimate government. I mean, I didn't even think they claimed the election wasn't on the up and up. I mean, it was, they won the election, and the U.S. and Israel started saying, no, it's unacceptable for you to rule. And that's, as I recall, that's why a civil war broke out between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, and why Hamas actually had to seize power forcefully.
Yeah. There's a very clear history that establishes how Israel helped establish Hamas to serve as a counterweight to Fatah and the Palestinian more secular party that currently controls the Palestinian Authority and is the party of Arafat, let's say. And they have long relied on a tactic of divide and rule, and so creating Hamas and supporting it and allowing it to operate was meant to weaken Fatah, and weaken Fatah it did, and it built its own base of support. In 2006, you're right, under George Bush II's doctrine to promote democracy, elections were held in Gaza and the West Bank, and in Gaza, Hamas did win in fair and free elections the majority of the seats in Gaza. The United States, and the Palestinian Authority then tried to launch a coup in Gaza in 2006 against Hamas, trying to install one guy named Mohammed Dahlan, who's now a UAE crony and lives in Dubai, but he failed and he was driven out. And since then, Hamas has ruled Gaza, and there's been no new election. In the face of Hamas's victory, however, Israel imposed a full blockade and siege of Gaza. So the siege of Gaza, the shutting down of the doors of the border of Gaza, limiting imports and exports, limiting fuel, limiting water, limiting everything, as the Israelis said, putting them on a diet, putting Palestinians on a diet to punish them for choosing Hamas, has been ongoing since 2006. Mm-hmm. So this is the situation that Gazans have faced for the past 17 years. An inability to travel to get medical care. 70% of the population unemployed and dependent on charity from abroad. Little bits of charity creeping in from Qatar. And growing population, an absolute time bomb, not enough water, not enough medicine. And everybody in the world very happy to ignore the misery and the suffering of the people in Gaza until they strike out, as they did with this horrific attack on southern Israel. And now everybody's talking about Gaza, but guess what? The people are going to suffer and be destroyed even more.
I think I recall, of course, there will be skeptics as to the sincerity of this, but right after the election that Hamas won, their leaders were interviewed, and I recall them making noises about being willing to live in peace. Now, I should be clear, as a technical matter, there was a jihad issued against Israel. So what in that context, what they were saying is, look, we could have a hudna, that's a truce, for a long, long, long time. Right? Like, I don't know if you remember this, but and this, of course, isn't your realm of expertise, like the actual motivation of Hamas. But of course, there are people in Israel, probably now more than ever, who think that Hamas just wants to kill all the Jews or kill all the Israelis or something. I have a very cynical view of human nature that suggests that actually, first of all, people's professed motivations can change over time if it's in their interest to change them. I have seen a couple of times where it seemed to me that there was a chance of moving Hamas toward moderation via engagement.
I mean, Bob, I don't think any of it matters. I don't think it matters whether there would be found a way to engage with Hamas or not engage with Hamas, because another group would come up to resist Israel if Hamas wasn't resisting Israel.
Well, yeah,
there's never going to be peace in Gaza, in the West Bank, for Palestinians, for Israelis, for anyone who lives there, until the occupation ends and until apartheid is ended. There are no human beings anywhere on this planet Earth that will live under subjugation in perpetuity. That's what people want of Palestinians. It's not going to happen. There's always going to be a fresh crop of young people who say, no, we're going to fight back any way we can. And that's the reality. So I've been around too many wars in Gaza and too many wars in Israel-Palestine for me to see that there is no other answer, and that the solution has to start with Israel ending its inhumane, illegal occupation of Palestinian territories and ending its inhumane, illegal apartheid rule over millions of people.
Yeah, well, actually, what I meant was a form of engagement that was actually sincerely directed from the kind of Israeli and American side, sincerely directed toward actually solving the problem. In other words, you have inducements, and it's
actually. How could they possibly do that? The U.S.
Well, I know. I mean, I grant you that. I grant you that.
Talk to them.
The U.S. and Israel, you mean?
No, they've declared
I know. It's a hypothetical.
Organization.
It was a thought experiment.
It doesn't matter. They have the PA. What are they doing to the PA?
The Palestinian Authority, right? I mean,
they're not negotiating with them either. They don't want to negotiate. They don't want to give up the land.
Well, I mean,
they don't want to give up the land. The government of Israel has said as openly as you can imagine, we want all the land of the West Bank too.
Right. No, I understand that. I just, and for that matter, for me to even suggest the U.S. and Israel engage Hamas, that's a wild fantasy. It's all a wild fantasy. I'm just saying that when people say Hamas, they're incorrigible, they're irreversibly committed to mass extermination or something, I'm thinking, I'm not sure we've really done the experiment of seeing what would happen if you engaged people who, yes, are radicals and extremists now, and gave them evidence that you're really trying to move things toward actual solution of the problem and, liberating the Palestinians for subjugation. That's the point. It's a hypothetical point.
I understand. I don't think it's the essential point. I think it's a side point. I think it's neither here nor there. Right.
Yeah, but what's the alternative?
The problem is the occupation. Anything else you try to solve for, let's build up Palestinian businesses. Let's build up Palestinian state institutions. Let's see that they can be a credible partner. It's all bullshit.
Yeah, it's always been bullshit.
Occupation has to end. The occupation has to end. If you don't end the occupation, nothing else matters.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm saying the claim that Hamas and other groups are irreversibly committed to the extermination of Jews or elimination of Israel, whatever, that the belief in that claim is one thing that makes ending the occupation even less likely than it is now. That's my point. Is like it's worth making the argument, I think, that there could have been a different present and there could be a different future.
Right.
You take my point.
I think you're right, but I mean, I think the Israeli authorities talk to Hamas and have been talking to Hamas secretly all this time. They have been, sharing intelligence even to contain some of the more extremist groups, including some ISIS cells inside Gaza. I think that the notion that Israel isn't ending the occupation because it's terrified of Hamas, I don't really buy it. If that were true, they wouldn't be literally expanding settlements as we speak, pushing more Israeli Jews into Palestinian territory, taking more Palestinian land. While this is happening in Gaza, nobody's even looking to see the settler brigades that are going in, raiding and terrorizing Palestinian villages in the West Bank. This is ongoing. That has nothing to do with Hamas, but they're doing it.
And that has been ramped up lately, right? I mean, a lot of attention has been paid, and I wrote about it because I think it's important, to the kind of predictable fact that this whole push for Arab-Israel normalization that started with the Trump administration and has been, if anything, accelerated by the Biden administration, the predictable fact that Hamas and Iran and the Palestinian people were all going to find that threatening for related reasons, different but related reasons. But in addition to that, there has been this ramping up on the West Bank, right, of settler violence, and at a symbolic level, if you look at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, what Palestinians view as infringements and the violation of longstanding kind of agreed upon rules about how the Al-Aqsa Mosque would be handled, right? I mean,
right. But the Abraham Accords I think have been proven exactly as I've been saying, and many of my colleagues have been saying for the past couple of years, to be a complete farce. They are predicated on
that's the normalization I was referring to, the first phase. Yeah, go ahead.
That we now see that there can be peace and stability in the Middle East if apartheid government of Israel allies with the criminal dictatorship, sadistic, sociopathic dictatorship of Saudi Arabia, or the autocratic dictatorships of the UAE, or the King of Morocco, that by forming normalization agreements with these unelected, illegitimate Arab dictators, there's going to be peace and stability in the Middle East. What a farce. What a farce. That you can just erase the Palestinian problem away just because the emir of UAE has signed a normalization agreement with Israel. You think the Palestinian people are going to care that it's going to make any difference to their national struggle, to their struggle for human rights? So this is, the magical thinking that started with the Trump administration, but the Biden administration drank all that poisonous Kool-Aid, and they made this normalization the centerpiece of their policy in the Middle East. Complete failure. And, maybe now's not the moment, but we need some accountability in the failed foreign policy leadership of the Biden administration.
I wrote this piece. I encourage people to check out the Nonzero newsletter. It was the last thing I wrote, is how predictably Biden's headlong pursuit of this Saudi deal was going to threaten key players like Hamas and not be welcomed by the Palestinians and so on, and could lead to trouble. So yeah, it's a bad situation. You've made me curious about what Hamas is actually saying about the rationale for the attacks, because they have to acknowledge they were targeting civilians. And I don't know, all I can imagine is that they make tactical claims. They make claims about how this being a necessary tactic. What I've said this before, but I think they would be better off if they had focused on the military targets. They would better serve the cause of Palestinians.
There's a long interview that two Hamas leaders gave on Al Jazeera in Arabic that was translated that addresses some of these points. So take a look.
So one thing, it's just what I'd like to know is, of the militants who came into who entered Israel and killed these people, 1,500 of them were killed, right? Apparently, the militants. So, Israel, I think, has said 1,300, 1,500 or something were killed in Israel. They probably knew they were taking quite a risk and might well die. And one thing I wonder is how many of them had friends or relatives who died in past Gaza-Israel conflicts, via Israel bombs. Not that that would be justification, but it does seem to me relevant to the wisdom of Israel now creating way, way more Palestinians in Gaza who will be able to say that relatives or friends of theirs were killed by Israel. And we've already reached a new threshold there. I don't know
anyone in Gaza who has not been personally injured and impacted by a loved one who was murdered or shot or maimed or crippled. In addition to the fact that every single person living in Gaza, and by the way, the majority of the population are under 18, have lived in a massive cage of 140 miles, as you were noting, their entire lives. Impossible to imagine ever leaving that cage. So, I saw Bill Ackman, this hedge fund guy, tweeting, "What would Americans do if this happened and they invaded a, concert of, young people having fun?" Well, what would they do? What would you do, Bill, if you were born and raised in a prison camp your entire life? No food, no electricity, no water, no jobs. It's a really awful situation. It's a really awful situation. And people reach their breaking points. We all do, right? We all do.
Yeah, I heard the president of Israel, Herzog, say, "We were living at peace. We were living at peace." And I mean, that's just not it's predictable that the Palestinians do not view it that way when they don't have, even in the West Bank, which is paradise compared to Gaza, they don't have, political rights, due process of law, and so on. And he was just like, what was the problem? Almost.
No, that's because Israelis have managed to inoculate themselves from the suffering of Palestinians for decades now, and they have been perfectly content to leave it in limbo, unaddressed, unsolved, as long as it doesn't touch them. That's been the formula. It's tragic. It's horrible.
Yeah, I by the way, just quickly on that point about how many Gazans, how many more Gazans are now going to be able to say, like, my sibling was killed by Israel, my cousin was killed by Israel as a result of what's going on now. The reason I bring that up is because even the voices of restraint are saying to Israel, look, this isn't going to ultimately succeed in truly eliminating Hamas. I would say it's even worse than that from Israel's point of view. You are creating the fuel for the next round. I mean, look, whatever you think of the guys who run Hamas, they have to convince a bunch of people, to commit these atrocities. They have to convince a bunch of people to go in and risk their lives to kill Israelis. It's a lot easier to do that if a bunch of these people have lost siblings.
Anywhere you go on this planet Earth, if you are under this kind of subjugation from the day that you're born for reasons that you don't even understand, maybe, you're going to fight back. That's human nature. We're human beings. Right?
Yeah, and I want to say, it's also human nature that, well, the context is, people have compared this to 9/11. I would say Israel, as ill-advised as I think what they're doing is, even from their own point of view, and as inhumane and illegal as you'd say it is, I don't think they're overreacting any more than we did to 9/11. I mean, 9/11, compared to what happened to Israel,
you don't
proportionally.
Have to think about 9/11. What about what we did to Iraq after 9/11?
Well, that is 9/11 in my book. That's part of the reaction to 9/11. I mean, I'm sure you remember Jeffrey Goldberg alleging.
Nobody's saying that Israel is the sole bad actor on this planet.
Right. But what I mean
this is what's happening now. And by the way, it's happening with U.S. support. This isn't just Israel. This is Israel and the U.S. As far as I'm concerned, this is Israel plus the U.S. massacring the people of Gaza.
Right.
The Israelis are using American weapons. The white phosphorus that they've been raining down on Gaza, American white phosphorus shells.
Yeah.
Under the ICC, under the Rome Statute, aiding and abetting by providing weapons is a criminal offense. So we're part of it. We're not just observers.
My tax dollars at work. I mean, literally, ammunition I paid for is killing civilians in Gaza right now. Yeah, when I say, but what I want to say, I mean, I'm not saying the Israelis are the only bad actors or Hamas is the only bad actors. I'm saying, sadly, often the bad actors are reacting the way humans react. They overreact to threats. Retribution is a strong human impulse. So, in that sense, I understand, for example, why the second Intifada terrified Israelis and led to overreaction. Which isn't to say that it did not have root causes itself, which isn't to say that. I'm just saying.
The bottom line is this cycle is just going to be repeated action, reaction, reaction, action until the occupation.
Because
that's the problem. If we don't solve for that problem, assessing how this battle was fought or that reaction was happened, or can we talk to Hamas? I mean, these are sort of details. Nothing is going to be resolved. Peace, peace, no security until the occupation is over.
I'm just saying the cycle of violence is ultimately driven by humans acting in a certain sense the way humans do if they are not, for some reason, enlightened by someone, right? And that's why if America is really Israel's friend, I think right now it would be saying, look, you are just planting the seeds for the next round right now.
We'll be calling for a ceasefire at the UN Security Council, but I expect that the U.S. will do the opposite and block a ceasefire resolution just like it did 2 years ago, 3 times.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess we've covered most of the questions I had. Is there anything else you want to say? I'm curious what you think of the way this is being processed. Are you disappointed by American voices that aren't speaking out? Are you gratified that some are, or what?
I mean, it's 2 things. One is that I share the horror of everybody else, including American journalists who observed these initial assaults on Israelis in southern Israel. I mean, it was shocking and it was horrific and appropriately covered. I'm disappointed that they repeated so many unsubstantiated claims that I think are used to drum up people's emotions, like the decapitated babies. At this point, I hope that any analysis of the current war contextualizes everything that's happening within the framework, the context of Israeli occupation of Palestinians. Palestinians are not occupying Israelis. Palestinians are not committing crimes against Israelis just by virtue of being there. Palestinians aren't stealing Israeli lands. They're not stealing Israeli water. They're not stealing Israeli farmlands. They're not destroying Israeli trees. These are things that are happening to Palestinians.
I mean, of course,
that's the essential problem.
Of course, and on some of these things, the settlers will say, well, we only burn down these trees because militants from this village tried to kill settlers. And there is this cycle. But one point you made go ahead.
The way to keep settlers safe is to get them out of occupied territory.
Well, I was going to say one point you made in our last conversation is that every settlement is itself a violation of international law. The Geneva Convention prohibition on transferring civilian populations to territory acquired by force.
That's right. That's the basic. I mean, it is a part and a plan of de facto annexation that Israel has been planning and expanding. And it has already annexed the Golan Heights with the blessing of the Trump administration. And the Biden administration has done nothing to undo that. It's as clear as day. Every international observer recognizes that Israel's goal is to annex Palestinian land and push out the Palestinian people. They're going to start, and they're doing it now by pushing the Gazans out to Egypt as much as they can, however much they can. And don't expect this to stop with Gaza. That's what I'll leave you with before we sign off. Don't expect this is going to begin and end with Gaza. They are going to and have been pushing Palestinians out of parts of the West Bank. And extremist Palestinian groups who are part of the government have very openly said they want to push the Palestinians into Jordan. So think of Gaza as a trial run.
Yeah. And then finally, I'd say if you look at, what the Biden administration would say about this attempt to get Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel as a kind of culmination of the Abraham Accords, is that, well, but we're part of this is that we get Israel to like finally address like the settlement issue. And it's like, it's all, I mean, come on. They're saying things like, we would get Israel to say that they will not annex the West Bank. Well, first of all, if it's Bibi who says it, how long do you expect the promise to last? But secondly, I mean, that's just not enough in the long run. I mean, it's a de facto annexation now, and that's what defines the conditions of the Palestinians in the West Bank.
Exactly. The Biden administration are cowards because I don't believe that even they believe the things they say. I don't believe it. I think it's short-term political calculation for what's best for a Biden re-election campaign, appearing to be strong on Israel, appearing to be supporting Israel with what Israel wants, which are these normalization agreements with the dictators in the region. I don't really believe that they sincerely think that this is anything that's going to bring peace and stability. And I hope that they're eating their words now for having said any of this gibberish publicly.
Oh, I think they're a long way from eating their words. I just think they don't get much pressure about this,
Yeah.
Now let me say, if you'll let me.
Are we almost done, by the way?
We're almost done, but I do want to say something. One thing I didn't do, this is a commercial announcement that I'm going to ask you to endure. It'll only last 40 seconds. One thing I sometimes do is interrupt these partway through and say, well, the rest of this will be behind the paywall. So become a paid subscriber to the Nonzero newsletter if you want to listen. I didn't want to do that with a conversation about this particular subject right now, but I do encourage people, if you think conversations like this are valuable, and if you've noticed that you don't see them on MSNBC, then let alone CNN or Fox News, I guess. But and you want to support the cause, you could go, Google Nonzero and Substack, become a paid subscriber. You get a lot of bonus content from podcasts, some written bonus content, and so on. The other things you can do to support us if you want, rate and review the Nonzero podcast on your podcast app at Apple Podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, you just click the like button. If you're a fan of these podcasts, you just click the like button at the beginning. That actually expands the audience through the magic of YouTube's algorithm. Finally, Sarah, why don't you tell us where we can find your stuff? I mentioned your Twitter feed, and it's just your name, right? Isn't it Sarah Leah?
Sarah Lee 1.
Oh, it's Sarah Lee. So it's SARAHLEAH with a digit 1? Yep. Okay, and where else?
Our organization is dawnmena.org, DAWNMENA, which stands for Democracy for the Arab World Now, Middle East and North Africa. dawnmena.org. Please visit our site for regular content, research, analysis, recommendations about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you got to catch a plane at some point today. Thank
you for having me.
Yeah. Hope to talk down the road, ideally under less traumatic circumstances.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.